I've always tried to be a good parent, or at least, that's what I tell myself when the guilt creeps in, especially after the argument with my son, Noah, last weekend. It started innocently enough. We were hosting a family barbecue, the kind that used to be full of laughter and joy, but things changed when his cousin, Mia, came over. Mia, with her bright smile, effortless charm, and an ease with people that Noah has never quite managed to grasp, was a whirlwind of energy as she sauntered into our yard after a long drive from the city. Noah, my 10-year-old introvert, sat rigidly at the corner of our deck, poking at his plate of burgers like they had personally offended him. When Mia launched herself at her younger sister, Chloe, squealing with delight and engaging her with an uninhibited joy that only kids should possess, I couldn't help but notice Noah's sulking expression grow darker. The longer he watched Mia laugh and play, the more withdrawn he became. It was as if every giggle was a dagger buried deeper into his heart, and the way my daughter fawned over Mia cut like shards of broken glass. I couldn't ignore it. When the barbecue came to a close, and I noticed Mia stuffing her face with cake while Noah stared blankly into his soda, I felt a pang of frustration bubbling up within me, a vile mix of heartbreak and anger that begged to be unleashed. So, I did what I shouldn't have. I confronted him. "You know, it's your fault she's happier to see Mia than she is to see you," I blurted out, the words laced with a sting I instantly regretted. Noah's face fell, his eyes wide with a combination of hurt and confusion, like a kid who'd just been told there's no Santa. He looked at me with a depth of sadness I had never seen before, and in that moment, I realized I had crossed a line, but it was too late to take it back. I watched him wilt under the weight of my words, and my heart twisted painfully as I heard Mia exclaim how much she missed Chloe, how they should have playdates all summer long, as Noah quietly snuck away from the group, headed inside like a ghost. The rest of the day was a haze. Laughter echoed outside while I stared at my untouched food as guilt coiled around my insides. It felt like the summer buzz had died with my son's spirit, and I couldn't bear to face the implications of what I had done. I watched Noah pace the floor of our living room, his brows knitted in concentration as if he were solving an unsolvable puzzle. I knew I'd hurt him but couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, my harsh words were a push he needed to confront his own struggles with social interactions. Parenting is a turbulent sea. Sometimes, you have to risk capsizing in order to teach your child how to swim. But that little thought didn't diminish the weight pressing down on me, a hand squeezing painfully around my heart while I tried justifying my big mouth. I spent the night tossing and turning, his shocked face replaying in my mind, a haunting echo of regret that morphed into nightmares filled with shadows whispering secrets of my failures. By morning, I decided I needed to talk to him, get his side of the story, and construct a bridge over this chasm I had opened with careless words. I found him in his room, so small and fragile in the dim, gray sunlight filtering through his window. When I sat beside him, he looked up, eyes stormy with a mixture of sorrow and anger. I wanted to reach out and pull him into my embrace, but something kept me rooted in place, the ghost of my previous words acting as a barrier. "Mom, why did you say that?" he asked, his voice steady but breaking at the edges. I fumbled for the right words but found none. "I didn't mean, I just wanted you to see." But stopped, trailing off, feeling the futility of my attempts. "Are you mad at me?" he said, and that broke me. I felt the hot rush of tears stinging my eyes as I wrestled with an instinct to just sweep him up and yell at him to express himself, let anger out into the ether rather than bottle it up like he always does. Noah was my delicate boy, always so kind but often mocked at school for being too soft. How could I say anything, be anything, when all I wanted was to shelter him from the world? "You're not to blame for anything, Mia is just more outgoing, and it shouldn't matter," I replied weakly, desperately clawing for some reassurance in my own voice while he stared at me, waiting for real honesty. I wanted to tell him that I was scared of his loneliness, scared that he wouldn't fit into the world the way I hoped for him, that every snide remark from his peers killed a piece of my heart. "You know what, Mom? I just want to be me," came those fragile words, breaking through the air, and in that moment, I realized how wrong I had been. As he turned away and stared out the window, I was reminded of crisp autumn days, golden leaves spiraling silently to the earth, and suddenly I felt the weight of my own expectations crashing down like thunder. I'd wanted my son to be someone he's not. The thought lingered long after he left to find solace in his video games, an echo of realization that resonated deep within me. It wasn't Noah who needed to change, it was me that needed to stop placing blame and start nurturing the incredible person he was destined to become. I knew I had to repair the rift I had caused, but how? Days passed, and I crafted a plan, an emotional lifeline, something to counter the agony of that summer gathering. I realized that he needed not just an apology but a show of faith in his individuality. A camping trip, just the two of us, away from the chaos, was something he could take pride in. So I took him one Saturday, packed the car with sleeping bags and junk food, and we left our technology behind, just the two of us, under the vast canopy of stars. I watched as Noah pitched the tent, his confidence growing little by little with each step he took, and I felt something shift in the air. The weight of guilt was still there but backed by hope too. As we sat around the campfire, with the crackling flames dancing in our eyes, I told him everything, how proud I was of him, how much his uniqueness meant to me, how I should have encouraged him to be himself rather than lash out in frustration. His grin lit up the night, warming the chill away like the flames before us, and in that magic moment, I saw a spark of resilience flicker in his soul. I realized something immensely powerful. By letting him feel just a bit of the weight of the world, he took the first step towards overcoming it. A few weeks later, things had transformed slightly. Noah laughed louder, started to engage with new friends from school, and I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of relief. It was as if my awful comments had forced a metamorphosis instead of breaking him, and as I watched him go through that new cycle of life, I knew I'd been wrong but that sometimes wrong turns can lead to unexpected growth. The barbecue wasn't the last. Family gatherings still echoed laughter just like that day did, but now I watched my son thrive instead of falter, and the cycle of hurt had turned into a cycle of healing, teaching him the resilience of the human spirit and that no matter what happens, coming back stronger is what truly matters. Amidst all that drama, amidst those blurted words and tearful evenings, there had emerged a tender understanding that formed deeper than any barrier, and while I may have blamed Noah, I realized it was just the gentle nudges of parenthood that pushed us both to be better versions of ourselves. In hauntingly beautiful ways, sometimes insensitivity can lead us to the love we really need. I never planned on becoming the villain in my friend's story. I merely wanted to help out and maintain the life I had carefully built around my aversion to anything feline. It all started when my friend Alex got the apparently brilliant idea to go on a 2-week trip to Europe and casually asked if I could house sit for him. It should have been a simple favor, but life has a twisted way of weaving its threads. When I asked him about his cats, thinking it was a simple oversight that he hadn't mentioned any pets, his reply shattered my world. "Oh, I didn't tell you. I adopted a cat last week." Alex knew I was allergic to cats, a fact I had grimly repeated over the years whenever the subject arose. Still, it tugged at my heartstrings imagining Alex alone in his empty apartment, so I reluctantly accepted, thinking maybe I could manage my allergies with medication. I figured 2 weeks would be short enough, and really, what's the worst that could happen? I packed my suitcase with all the supplies I'd need and drove to his apartment, my heart pounding from what I thought would be a myriad of potential indignities, the litter box, the scratching posts, the howling at odd hours, but nothing prepared me for what awaited me behind that front door. I stepped inside, greeted by the smell of artificial lavender, which offered no solace among the unease in my stomach. There were no litter boxes in sight, which I falsely assumed was a positive, until I noticed the shadows in the corners, and that's when I saw it, lounging ever so regal, the cat, a majestic Maine Coon with eyes that seemed to pierce through my cowardice and right into my very soul. I swallowed my fear and decided to figure out the whole house sitting for a friend part first before confronting the furry dilemma clawing its way to the forefront of my mind. I spent the evening cleaning, moving through the apartment with a meticulousness born from dread, taking careful naps to adjust to the new environment, all while glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the cat to spring out with a hyperactive playtime charm. It didn't take long before I discovered the scattered pieces of shredded furniture, a hallmark of the Maine Coon's unstated dominance. It was everywhere I turned, and I felt each glimmering eye roll like 1,000 tiny daggers. By the second day, the allergy pills had become my lifeline, and still, my skin itched feverishly. The sneezes came and went, but each bout felt like a personal rejection. I started to feel trapped inside Alex's stylish prison furnished with litter and fur-covered nightmares. In my anxious haze, I reached for my phone to send Alex a barrage of confused messages, but the messages remained unanswered, his silence exaggerated by a growing sense of dread. I threw caution to the wind and went for a late-night snack, a struggle against the dulling effects of the antihistamines that pooled in my veins. I crossed the living room, but just before I turned the corner to the kitchen, I froze at the dim light washing over a strange silhouette, a ball of fur with gleaming eyes watching me like I was an unwanted guest at my own damn party. I stood frozen in that bedroom-lit twilight, caught in the sight of the beast, realizing that I had not truly committed myself to tracking the cat's ominous movements for 2 solid days. I nodded slowly and backed away into the darkness, but it wasn't long before I heard it, a low, throaty growl emanating from the very creature I thought I could ignore. The creature was no longer lounging lazily, it was now a predator scanning its territory. Panic surged through me, and I silently retreated to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. Sleep came in short, sporadic bursts, cut into jagged pieces by the sound of claws dragging across the hardwood floor, growing closer and closer until I could almost hear the beat of my own heart shaking like an earthquake beneath the sheets. Day 5 loomed overhead like dark clouds, and when I finally saw Alex's name flash across my screen, I nearly dropped my phone. He simply wanted to know how everything was going. I hesitated when typing my reply, concerned that Alex would think I was being overly dramatic. When I finally confessed my plight, he laughed through the texts, telling me I just needed to get used to it. Most people would be thrilled to house sit, and deep down, I wanted to be one of those people. I agreed to persevere, trying my hardest to convince myself that I was still game. After all, Alex was a good friend. That night, sleep eluded me, and as I lay awake drowning in the darkness, I heard a sudden thud from the living room followed by the unmistakable sound of claws against wood. My heart raced as I understood that something was broken in it in that instant. I knew I had to confront the cat, perhaps even save myself from whatever misfortune would befall me if I continued to hide. The moonlight spilled through the windows, illuminating the living room, and there it stood, the cat on top of a crumpled magazine, an anarchist queen. I took a deep breath, about to approach it, when the beast turned slowly, its pupils constricting into narrow slits that sent waves of terror washing over me. For the first time, I noticed that the fur around its mouth was matted, sticking together in jagged clumps, reminiscent of blood. Disoriented, I blinked and staggered backward, and, in those precious moments of processing, it let out a growl that echoed through my bones, reverberating as a monstrous promise of violence. I stumbled through the door desperately, trying to shut it behind me, but the cat was faster. I barely managed to slam the door shut before I heard the impact of paws against the wood, scratching mercilessly like a predator that had just caught wind of prey. I didn't know what to do at that moment. Should I call Alex, take my chances and run out into the night with no clear destination? Footsteps approached, and I prepared for an assault, but there was only silence afterward. The doorknob rattled, followed by that haunting growl again. This time, it echoed deeper into my mind, as though I were being called back into the living room from which I'd fled. Heart racing, shaken, I slowly turned the knob and opened the door, peeking through the gap like a spy. A chilling realization swept over me. The living room was empty, yet in the stillness, the cat's ominous presence felt imprinted all over the space around me. I stepped in, ready to confront whatever reality awaited behind my own disbelief, but all I saw was a scattering of debris on the floor, no blood, no cat. I swallowed the scream rising in my throat and fled to the window, ready to scream, but suddenly my phone buzzed again. An urgent notification sucked me back into the nightmare. It was Alex's name, but when I opened the message, my breath caught. "Hey, sorry I'm late getting back to you. Just wanted to give you a heads up, there's something weird going on with Felix. He keeps scratching at the door. Maybe don't let him in?" In that moment, I couldn't help but wonder who was truly trapped here, who was really the house sitter in all this, and suddenly Alex's words felt like a prophecy echoing through the dark. I glanced back toward the door, and the growl returned like the laughter of a madman. I never thought my wedding would end in chaos, but when my cousin Lisa showed up in a blood-red gown that clashed with the white theme of my ceremony, it felt like I'd walked into a horror movie instead of my dream day. I had been preparing for this moment for months, pouring my heart and soul into every detail, from the flowers to the music, all meticulously designed to evoke the purest enchantment. While I floated down the aisle in the lace gown I had envisioned since childhood, the embodiment of everything I had ever wanted. I remember the moment I spotted Lisa, standing smugly in the doorway of the venue with that gaudy dress that mirrored the sinister beauty of a vampire in some cheap film. I felt the air chill around me, my stomach twisting with a mixture of disbelief and anger. Didn't she know this day wasn't about her? The whispers of my friends buzzed in my ears, murmurs of disdain that fed my fury as I approached her, my carefully cultivated smile now plastered on my face like a mask. "Lisa, why are you here?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady, knowing the photographer was capturing every moment. "I thought it'd be a nice surprise," she replied, her tone dripping with faux innocence. At that moment, I remembered every family gathering where Lisa had overshadowed me, every snide comment she had made that belittled my choices, and I resolved that today would be different. My heart raced as I glanced back at my fiancé, who had excused himself to handle a family emergency but had assured me moments before that he couldn't wait to see me in my dress. Deep down, I didn't want to cause a scene, but her presence felt threatening, malignant, like she was festering in the happy blooms of this day, ready to checkmate me. As I took a step closer, Lisa's eyes flashed with that familiar defiance that prickled the nape of my neck. "What's your issue?" "It's just a color," she responded, feigning ignorance, but the challenge in her voice stoked the fire brewing inside me. "It's not just a color, it's a wedding." I shot back, my fury bubbling to the surface as I wrestled with the decision weighing on my conscience. A part of me was screaming to turn back, to let it slide and just enjoy the day, but another part clung to the bubbling rage, a sense of justice that demanded action. "Leave. Now," I spat, my fingers trembling as I clenched them into fists. The guests' eyes locked onto us, an audience drawn into an unfolding drama that felt vividly alive as whispers rippled through the crowd, but rather than fear, I felt a surge of adrenaline at reclaiming my day, my moment. Lisa's facade cracked, anger bubbling up beneath her flawless skin as she opened her mouth to retort, but all I could think about was how tired I was of being walked over, tired of being the unobtrusive cousin, the forever witness to her eclipses, tired of everything that had been unsaid over the years. "You're making a mistake. This is ridiculous. You're ruining your own wedding. Over something so petty," she shouted, her voice cutting through the whispers, drawing me closer to confrontation. I could see the shock on the faces of a few of my aunts, the mixture of gasps and raised eyebrows filling the room with anticipation, but I had crossed the threshold, I couldn't stop now. With every ounce of resolve I could muster, I turned my back on her, striding toward the wedding coordinator, whose eyes widened in disbelief and then mirrored my determination. "Security, please," I commanded, my heart drumming like a war cry as I heard Lisa hiss behind me, the noise echoing with the venom of a snake cornered, but I pressed on. I knew what having her there meant. It wasn't just about the dress, it was about the years of her putting me in the shadows. Moments later, two burly men approached, their expressions neutral yet ready, and when they were instructed to escort Lisa out, the look of hurt and fury painted her face as she went limp, her shock overwhelming her defiance. "You'll regret this," she spat as she was guided out, each word a dart aimed at my heart, as I stood there, shaking but finally feeling light, the burden of her specter lifted from my shoulders, the weight of my family's toxicity unfurling in the dust behind her. The ceremony resumed, but I could feel the eyes of my relatives boring into my back, the murmurs of disapproval hanging in the air thick as fog, and I couldn't tell if they were aggrieved by my actions or secretly relieved to be rid of the drama Lisa seemed to constantly bring. My heart sank as I realized what I'd done. The moment of triumph had morphed into a shadow of regret, the whispers of bridezilla and family tension stirring uncontrollably around me like a whirlwind of judgmental stares. As the vows were exchanged and I glanced around, I couldn't shake the feeling that Lisa wouldn't take this lightly, especially with her threatening words hanging heavy in the air. After the ceremony, as the reception blossomed around me in joyful chaos, laughter, dancing, and so many smiles, my joy felt marred by the creeping shadow of guilt. Could I really celebrate a day that, in some way, felt marred by the act of banishment? I tried to brush away the thoughts, focusing instead on the love swelling in my chest for my husband and the genuine moments shared with our friends, but Lisa's presence loomed heavily in my mind like a specter waiting to strike. Days turned into weeks, and just as I thought I could forget about the wedding drama, my phone buzzed late one night, draining the color from my face. It was a group text from my family. My heart raced as I opened it to find a picture of Lisa in that hideous, blood-red gown, with the caption, "Some weddings should be cancelled." My stomach dropped like a stone as her slander spread through our family like wildfire. The rising tide of animosity was making its way toward me, wrapping around my throat, threatening to suffocate the joy I had fought for. Each Sunday dinner became an arena of cold silence, excluding me from family conversations as I was framed as the villain, and while I was initially defensive, the weight of isolation left me gasping. The day finally came when I was invited to a family gathering with an air of dread. As I stepped through the front door, I could practically feel the judgment dripping from the ceiling fixtures. I quietly made my way to the living room, my heart thundering loudly against my ribcage as I caught sight of Lisa, clad in white this time, sitting smugly at the center of the table like some dark queen surveying her territory. The tension gripped me like an iron fist, clenching my heart as unwelcome memories spiraled back. Her smirk twisted with cruelty was overwhelming, laying bare the extent of her hunger for vengeance. I stood frozen in place, contemplating my next move when Lisa's eyes met mine with a glint of sadistic glee, as if she had been waiting for this very moment. "Oh look, the bride graces us with her presence. Didn't you know weddings are supposed to be about everyone?" She quipped, laughter bubbling around her like a toxic potion, and just like that, the room shifted, murmurs erupting anew as I felt their eyes darting with interest between us. Her words were daggers, driving my insecurities deeper, igniting an inferno of rage within me, but instead of striking back as I longed to, all I could muster was a weak smile. "I'm glad to see you, too, Lisa," I managed to reply, forcing the words to escape, every syllable leaving a bitter taste in my mouth while her laughter washed over me like a tide, depending on the whispers of my family to feed her power. As the evening wore on, I noticed that my cousin didn't relent, sowing discord with poisoned words, planting unease in the hearts of my loved ones that grew more potent with every sip of wine. When I left that night, I felt the confines of my own family closing in, shadows whispering ever so softly, was I really the villain? But the truth was, standing at the edge of that wedding day, I had fought for myself in a world that always sidelined me, and even if the consequences were grave, I couldn't say I didn't deserve my moment of victory, however fleeting. So, AITA for having my cousin thrown out of my wedding. I don't know yet, but as I drive away, the question trembles in my mind: what kind of family comes together by building their foundation on the bones of betrayal? I never thought I'd find myself in a situation that blurred the lines between right and wrong, but as I stood outside the theater, the vibrant energy of the evening dulled by a series of increasingly impatient glances, I wondered if I had crossed an invisible boundary. I was there to see Wicked, a show I'd been looking forward to for months, and as the line wrapped around the building under the bright streetlights, anticipation thickened in the air. My phone buzzed incessantly with eager messages from friends eager to meet after the show, but I was determined to shut it out and soak up the excitement. That's when I saw her, a woman, mid-30s, vibrant red hair cascading over her shoulders, standing right in front of me, engrossed in an animated phone conversation that seemed all too important to her. I tried to ignore the growing annoyance in my chest and drowned out her loud laughter, but every witty retort and self-indulgent chuckle felt like a dagger driving deeper into the heart of my evening. I mean, come on. Some of us were here to enjoy an extraordinary performance, not to witness private conversations at full volume. As the minutes ticked down to the start time, my irritation boiled over. "Excuse me." I mustered the courage to call out, the sound of my voice slicing through the buzz of excited chatter. She turned, her surprised eyes locking onto mine with a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Can you please be a little quieter? Some of us actually want to enjoy the pre-show." The words rushed out like bile. A ripple of silence fell over the line, all eyes now glued to us. I could feel the weight of judgment in the air. What was supposed to be a brief moment of assertive clarity had turned into a live performance for the waiting crowd. Instead of shrinking back like I expected, she exploded. "Aren't you just the biggest little snob?" Her voice heightened, dripping with sarcasm. She held the phone in one hand, brandishing it like a sword, and her laughter abruptly transformed into a high-pitched giggle as if she were mocking me. Maybe if some of us weren't so uptight, we'd get to enjoy the show a bit more. Ever think of that? Each word hit hard, like stones thrown in anger, igniting a ripple of laughter behind her as her friends rallied around the charge. My fists clenched at my sides, the blood pounding in my ears so loudly I could barely hear my thoughts. I could see other theatergoers carving out their opinion in the way they looked at me, a mix of sympathy and disapproval. It was then that a realization struck, a crack in my composure. Maybe I was being unreasonable, but that didn't stop my temper from flaring, and before I knew it, I yelled back, "Maybe you don't need to share every detail of your miserable life with the world. Ever think some of us are here to escape it?" The gasp from the crowd was palpable, like a sudden intake of breath before an intense scene. The woman's face twisted in disbelief, her laughter abruptly cut off, leaving a painful silence hanging in the chilly night air. An angry flush crept up my neck, and just when I thought the moment might pass, she stepped closer, her eyes narrowed and her voice dropping to a whisper, bitter and low. "You think this is a show for you to escape to? You've only scratched the surface of what life can throw at you, and let me tell you, and I know you won't believe me, this is nothing compared to real pain." I felt something twist in my gut at the challenge in her gaze, a feeling that there was more at play than just a rude theatergoer. Each heartbeat echoed with my growing unease, and the crowd around us felt like they were holding their breath, waiting for a resolution to this absurdity that had taken on a life of its own. She was right, in a way. How could I know what monsters lurked in her reality? But as the theater doors swung open, spilling warm light and murmurs of music out into the cool night air, I realized I didn't care. I was tired, too tired, of dealing with selfish people in a world that oftentimes felt far too chaotic. Without thinking, I waved her off dismissively, my voice laced with frustration. Whatever. Enjoy your unnecessary phone call. That must have struck a nerve, because she glanced back at me for a split second before rejoining her group of friends, and just as quickly as the confrontation had begun, it fizzled. I was left there, feeling the weight of my anger linger, tangled with something more profound, an unsettling sense of dread. The show started, and I tried to immerse myself in the enchantment of emerald green costumes and soaring melodies, but her laughter still rang in my ears, creating a friction in my mind I couldn't shake. What if she's right? My own thoughts haunted me like phantoms as I watched the story unfold on stage, the vibrant colors slipping by but never fully capturing my attention. Images of her piercing green eyes, that moment of shared rage, replayed in my mind. Who was I to judge anyone's choices, especially when my own life felt tangled and unpredictable? Then something shifted. I noticed she was sitting 2 rows down from me as the act wore on, and to my dismay, they were still laughing, still talking, this time at a whisper, but clearly still engaged with their phones, still distracting in ways that made me grit my teeth. The frustration boiled over again until I could stand it no longer. I stood up, heart pounding, and hissed, "Can you please just put your phones away and watch the show?" The words felt like fire leaping from my throat, but all they earned me was a triumphant glance from the woman. It was as if she was waiting for this, even expecting me to lash out again, and that was when I knew it was no longer about her phone call. It was an insidious dance of power and pride, and I was entrapped. She casually leaned back, smirk lacing her features. "You really think making this a bigger spectacle makes you some kind of hero?" She shot back, laughter bubbling from her lips, buoyed by the cheers of her friends. My blood turned to ice, and it dawned on me, I was being played. Her deliberate entrapment had turned the heat of my anger into a fiery embarrassment. Just as I recoiled, I felt a deep pull of anxiety fill the recesses of my mind, like an extreme panic gnawing at me, and I sank back into my seat, overwhelmed. I was now the unwitting star of a show I didn't intend to be in, and all I wanted was to disappear. After the final curtain call, I stumbled out onto the streets, a numbing shame seeping into my bones. I was both the villain and the fool, caught in a careless confrontation that had turned the joyous night sour. But as I walked away, I couldn't quite shake the sense that this experience had changed something within me. It was no longer just about her phone call, it was a mirror reflecting my own failings and a story that continued on without me, left to fester on the streets as I disappeared into the night. Was I the asshole for yelling? Maybe. But the truth stung brighter than any shame. Honesty splintered in a way I hadn't expected. My life was messy, and sometimes boundaries need to be drawn, even at the cost of losing sight of the enchantment a show could bring. So maybe, just maybe, the real question was, could I forgive myself for demanding silence in a world filled with chaos, or chalk it all up to an unhappy accident never to be resolved? Last summer, my 6-year-old son Max came rushing into the living room, frame brimming with the triumphant energy only a child committed to an idea can muster, announcing he'd decided to get a pet snake, a decision I met with equal parts dread and challenge. Rewind a week, and I had let him watch a documentary about reptiles, telling him all the wonderful things about them, how they're silent, mysterious, and perfectly contained. It seemed harmless at the time until Max's fixation intensified, drowning out everything else until it became a daily ritual. He'd research snakes for hours, holding on to facts about their eating habits and habitat. Their sinister, hypnotic movements made him dream of becoming a snake whisperer. I was the one holding the reins on reality. Snakes create nightmares, don't they? We live in a suburb spattered with kids, and most of them had puppies and kittens. I couldn't imagine the looks I'd get from the other parents if they sporadically encountered my boy frolicking with a long, scaled creature in the yard, or worse, if it escaped into the neighborhood. Thus, I decided to inject some realism into this fantasy. I called a local reptile rescue and arranged a visit. The day arrived, easing my nervousness as I drove to the small facility where scaly creatures sat in enclosure after enclosure, murmuring secrets of the wild. My heart raced with a mix of excitement and dread, half expecting a Houdini snake to leap from its cage and fly for freedom. But upon entering, Max's eyes reflected nothing but awe. He glided from tank to tank, glued to the glass, scarcely breathing, while I stood off to the side, dread building like a storm cloud. Then it happened. He spotted a black mamba. The staff warned us, they weren't kidding, and it was terrifyingly beautiful, its sleek body glistening in the fluorescent light, an almost hypnotizing sight as it flickered its tongue in and out, tasting the air. One of the workers, noting Max's fascination, leaned in with a guarded seriousness. You know, they are deadly, right? I could sense Max's excitement inching toward horror, but instead of pulling him away, I decided to reinforce reality. See, Max? This is what I mean about snakes. They can seem mesmerizing, but they're also dangerous. No one should have one in the house unless they really know what they're doing. His sparkle dimmed, brows knitted together in confusion and disappointment. So we can't have one, Dad? My heart seared at the thought, and unable to meet his determined gaze, I replied, absolutely not. Just then, he turned on his heel, storming out of the room, the pent-up resolve of a child shattered with a single blow, and I thought maybe I had overdone it, but I nursed the belief that I did it for his safety, though a creeping guilt began to take root. We arrived home, and the atmosphere shifted, the air felt static, and I saw Max's face harden into a stubborn expression that told me this wasn't over yet. Days turned into a battlefield of tears and tantrums, him pleading for even a small, harmless snake, swearing he would care for it himself if I'd just let it happen. Don't you trust me? He'd yell, and my heart splintered as I struggled against an invisible wall growing ever higher. Then came the day that broke me. I remember barely holding together my nerves when Max burst into the kitchen wielding a crumpled sheet of paper he'd drawn upon. This is me, he shouted, presenting a crude, bright crayon drawing that depicted him with a snake coiling around his tiny waist, a face devoid of fear, its smile matching his own. I felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't just art, it was his way of coping, of becoming the snake charmer he thought he could be, and suddenly, in the moment of false triumph, the room felt too small. My breath caught as I realized how desperately he wanted to connect, turning a simple pet into a bridge to something bigger. Mom and I have talked about it. Just trust me, Dad, I'll be gentle, he insisted, but I was rigid, turning his innocent plea into a fortress of rejection. Max, it doesn't matter. I won't let you get hurt, I snapped, and there it was, the crushing realization hit me. In protecting him, I was breaking him, and the tears rolled down his cheeks, the paper falling like a forgotten dream as he staggered back. It rumbled, guilt rolled in waves through my head as I saw him flee, a small silhouette against bright walls, and seconds later, I heard the door slam behind him. I found him curled up in the corner of his room, sobbing softly into his pillow, and at that moment, every rationalization melted away. I wanted to apologize but felt locked in, trapped by my decision and the fear of looming judgment from everyone around me, including myself. We are parents, aren't we? We bear the weight of our children's pain and dreams, but I couldn't shake that feeling. I went to give him a hug, but he recoiled, wiped his face angrily, and spat, "Just leave me alone. You don't care about me." Over the next few days, that wretched guilt clung to me like a shadow, pushing my thoughts into darker corners. I tried to engage him in other activities, to erase the memory of that day, but he wouldn't have it. He'd draw more pictures, always involving the same snake, and I'd push it down, push it aside. Until one evening, while sorting through the junk, I stumbled across my college roommate's journal filled with ramblings about folklore and mysticism surrounding animals thought possessed by spirits. I got lost in dark avenues and old stories and discovered something I hadn't thought of in years, a legend about snakes and the children that could speak to them as if they shared a bond of telepathy. My heart raced as I wrestled with thoughts, and that night I couldn't sleep. I dreamt, or rather, I was haunted by Max, and in my dream, he stood with a snake wrapped around his body, looking at me with those big, watery eyes. "Dad, you let it take me," he said, his voice a fragile echo reverberating through the unmistakable serpentine coil. I woke with a start, panting and drenched in horror, an involuntary promise forming on my lips that I would fix this. I needed to make amends before it settled into something irreparable. I knew then that I had to find a way to show Max I believed in him. I mustered every ounce of will and landed on an idea. After all, he wouldn't let the snake slip from his soul, and I had no choice but to let him learn. So, weeks later, with trembling hands and a racing heart, I returned to that facility, but this time apprehensive hope guided my steps. I explained to the same employee about my son's growth, his unwavering passion, and an idea sparked. Maybe you can help teach him, I ventured, so that I can see him grow without fear. And I swear, the generous smile from the employee felt like a key. Maybe this wouldn't destroy my child but nurture a fierce respect instead. That weekend, I set everything up, asking Max to join me at the facility to unveil my decision. When I saw him, the wall of anger dissipated, and I whispered, "I found out we're getting you lessons with a trainer," and for a moment, pure astonishment lit up his face. The floodgates burst open as he threw his arms around me, sobbing with gratitude, releasing so much pent-up tension and fear. It felt like heavy weights slipping off my chest, and for the first time, we were back to where we belonged. But then came the creaking feeling of dread. A small, yet haunting voice within reminded me of how close it had come to breaking, and as Max reported how excited he was to learn proper handling, I imagined how close we'd been to losing everything. In the weeks that followed, I often observed Max in the lessons, seeing him step into an understanding that wasn't dictated by fear but by love and respect for the creatures that might seem unimaginable to parents like me. Yet, unease lurked in the air. That gnawing feeling grew as though the snake knew secrets we weren't privy to, and one night as I tucked Max into bed, I caught a glimpse of his crayon drawing sitting atop the bedside table, the snake at its center, smiling, almost sentient as if it held power over our world. A chill coiled around my spine as if it was vital to something far greater than us, and as I left his room, I couldn't help but wonder if there was truth behind the idea that some bonds, like love for those serpents, could also hold dangerous potential. When my grandmother passed away last month, grief wrapped around me tighter than the layers of fabric in my well-worn dark gray coat, the only one I'd ever needed for funerals. It didn't matter that it was the same coat I'd worn to bury my father just a few years before. I remember standing beside my mother at the dining table, her eyes swollen, reflecting a bleak mix of sorrow and irritation as she insisted that I needed a new black coat for the funeral because, in her words, black is the color of mourning, and your father would never forgive you for showing up in dark gray. I didn't understand why a different coat mattered so much when the sorrow it cloaked was the same, but she couldn't fathom that my attachment to that gray coat went beyond aesthetics. Desperate for my own space amidst the chaos of grief, I refused her demands, feeling my heart thud heavily as family discussions dwindled to whispered criticisms directed at me, portraying me as the ungrateful son who couldn't muster the decency to honor his deceased relatives appropriately. The societal pressure to wear a fresh coat became unbearable, and as I walked through the house that echoed with muted memories of family gatherings and laughter, I felt as though the essence of my loved ones lingered in the folds of that same coat, every crease a moment shared, every thread a lesson learned. On the night before the funeral, my mother barricaded herself in her room, and I found myself outside, staring at the growing shadows of the trees in our yard, their gnarled branches twisting like the pain inside me. I was losing everything dear, quickly engulfed by an anxious fog that choked my breaths, and yet, there was a stubborn part of me that clung to that old coat like a life buoy amidst rising tides of despair. Just as I resolved to wear what I felt connected to, I saw the weathered figure of my grandmother, her spectral form flickering in the moonlight, clutching the rope in her hands, just out of my reach. She whispered secrets of the past in the rustle of the leaves, and I felt something shift in my core, a reconciliation with her essence urging me onward. When I finally slipped that coat on, its lingering scent comforting and reminiscent of days gone by, I felt her approval envelop me, more potent than any new black fabric could offer. I may have failed to meet the expectations of a mother mourning her mother, but as I walked into the funeral home the next day, my chest expanded fiercely, fusing the layers of loss into one coherent resolve. However, it wasn't the weight of the coat that caught the attention of others, it was the hushed conversations around me, the scathing glares that sliced through the room and branded me as the odd son. My heart raced as I held my breath for the eulogies, seeking solace in the heartfelt sentiments shared by relatives, but when the speech turned toward traditional attire, my heart sank. I looked around to see the disapproving glances, relatives who I'd only ever seen dressed in black now aimed to paint my grief as colors beyond the spectrum of acceptance, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the disdain and disappointment whispered behind my back echoed louder than the sorrowful words being uttered. No. I wouldn't let that coat overshadow the memories embodied in my actions. I held the fabric tight, its significance well known only to me and my grandmother, who had poured her soul into sewing all the buttons that clasped their spirit through intertwining threads of our family's legacy. Halfway through the eulogy, I stepped outside to collect my thoughts, greeted by the crisp bite of late autumn air, which felt like a bitter reprimand, punctuating that pervasive loneliness which seemed to chase me even in the company of family. My resolve wavered as the temptation to conform roared in my chest. I shuffled my feet, heart pounding as whispers about me drifted through the thin walls, shrouding me in a tempest of guilt. Did I really deserve to hold on to my memories, my grief, while causing a rift in my family? Just as doubt flooded my being, a rustling sound came from behind me, an old woman in a shabby old coat, much like mine. She didn't appear lost in sorrow but radiant in the brilliance of her past. I noticed the subtle but defiant sparkle in her eyes. She leaned in and whispered, "Tell me, dear boy, does a coat determine love? Does the ink of fabric hold the grave weight of grief, its fabric woven in time?" A second passed, and I felt the urge to spill my heart to this stranger, her presence igniting a warmth that made the chill of discontent fall away. "Be true to your love, dear heart," she continued, "that is the only thread that carries you through the veil." By the time I returned inside, I had shed the chains of my mother's expectations, ready to face the judging gasps with conviction. I reclaimed that gray coat, stigmata of love laced with mourning. It had become a monument, and I, in my unyielding stance against convention, finally understood that it wasn't a question of right or wrong. It was a testament to the bond shared with those we have buried in the earth, a visual legacy that would haunt the fabric of our lives forever. Yet, just when I believed my resolve would silence the whispers, something jolted me, something I couldn't explain. As I stood there, tears spilling down my cheeks, the air grew painfully thick. A chilling wail erupted from behind me, sending a shiver down my spine as the elderly lady's comforting presence began to dissolve into darkness, the echoes of her words transforming into a strange song filling the room. It was as if the shadows were hungry for the bonds we'd forged, ready to unravel every moment I had thought was sacred. My heart raced again, but this time, it was gripped in vice-like fear. What had I unleashed by clinging to my beloved gray coat? Suddenly, the cacophony of mourning morphed into laughter. Family members were grinning grotesquely, their faces stretching uncomfortably, eyes gleaming with desperation as if they desired to wrestle my coat from me, as if the very fabric prevented them from accessing the shared mourning we all needed to bury. As they moved toward me, engulfing my space with taunts of betrayal, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had focused on me. The burden I carried had morphed into a sort of interloper that would not allow my family the catharsis they so demanded. I was slipping into a darkness that resonated deeply from the fabric, as though the memories that should have kept me rooted were becoming malicious, dragging me into depths of despair where coats had never mattered, but souls did. They were reaching for the coat, their laughter edging into madness, and I realized the family beneath the funeral garb had become ravenous specters, controlled by their hidden grief and impossible expectations. In that moment, grief twisted sinister, submerged in a deep well that churned beneath the fabric I clung to like a lifeline, and all I could do was turn and run, abandoning the whispers, the coiling darkness that craved to drag me into their ocean of shared torment, while my heart echoed with the ghosts of memory that tangled with the whispers of goodbye. Just when I thought I'd escaped the nightmare, I fell through the door, tumbling out into the cold world, only to see the reflection of that old woman, standing on the brink of the graveyard, beckoning me back as shadows flickered around my shivering frame. I screamed, not caring who heard me, trapped between guilt and love, whispers of family now reinforcing the doom that followed on the wind. "Ida," I thought to myself, clutching at the dark gray coat that reflected my soul's turmoil, feeling time unfurl as the threads of my life became wisps of mourning, as fragile and relentless as the hatred swelling within. "I'm not sure how to start this without sounding melodramatic, but I need to share this before it eats me alive." My friend Danny, who, like me, is 23 years old, had been pestering me to set him up with my best friend, Laura, for months. She's beautiful, smart, and genuinely one of the best people I know. We had been friends since childhood, and after a slew of terrible dates, I thought, why not? On paper, they seemed like a match made in heaven. Both love horror movies, the same music, and they both had quirky senses of humor. But every time I tried to broker this budding romance, something fell through. He would flirt with her one moment and then completely ghost her the next, and I could see how it hurt Laura when he'd vanish as if she were nothing. Finally, I confronted Danny about it. "What's your deal? If you want to date her, then do it. Don't just toy with her feelings," I told him one night as we shared drinks. He shrugged it off, saying he was just busy. I didn't buy it, but I let it go, until the day they finally met up, a Friday night that still haunts me. When I got the call from Laura the next morning, I could hardly believe what I was hearing. "He stood me up, and he didn't even text me to say he wouldn't come," she choked out between sobs, and as she recounted her harrowing experience waiting in that stupid cafe with her heart in her throat, I felt rage boil within me. Danny had let her wait for 2 hours before sending a text that something came up, which is code for, I couldn't care less about you. I spent the rest of the weekend comforting Laura, who couldn't understand what had gone wrong. She deserved better, and all I could think of was Danny's selfishness. The following week, I told Danny I was done helping him. AITA for refusing to set up my friend anymore after he stood up my best friend? I asked him directly, hoping for some sign of remorse, but he shrugged it off as if it didn't matter. He laughed, a hollow sound that seemed to echo in the confines of my mind, and that's when I noticed it, the change in him, something darker lurking beneath the surface. I thought it was just disappointment at being denied a date, but then things started getting weird. A few days later, Laura and I found a note on her car windshield, scrawled in handwriting I didn't recognize, reading, "You should find someone who actually wants you," and it sent chills down my spine. I dismissed it as some random jerk, but then she began receiving messages on social media from a profile with no followers or posts. The person behind it clearly knew things about her that they shouldn't have, places she frequented and inside jokes we had shared. Each time I texted Danny, he ignored me or gave flippant responses that made my stomach twist. "My bad," he'd write back. "I've been busy." I had started keeping track of the odd notes and the increasingly menacing messages Laura was receiving. They grew more and more detailed, leaning closer toward stalking. I began to wonder if it was all a sick game played by Danny to get back at Laura for humiliating him by uncovering his true nature. But I didn't confront him again, fearing what might happen if I pushed. I was convinced he was somehow involved. They were intertwined in a twisted fate that I could no longer untangle. On a freezing December evening, Laura and I went out to grab some groceries, both feeling the weight of the ominous recent events. She pulled out her phone and went pale. There it was again, a message waiting for her: "You should really stay home tonight." The lights flickered above us as a sickening chill washed over me, and I could swear that a shadow crossed over the grocery store. Moments later, Laura and I split up to grab the last few items on our list, and when I turned down the cereal aisle, I noticed a figure at the far end. His back was turned to me, but his posture was all too familiar. Panic surged through me. Danny had been sneaking around while I wasn't paying attention. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned slightly, just enough for me to glimpse his face, and I felt my heart drop. It wasn't Danny at all, but someone who looked alarmingly similar, a glint of madness in his eyes. I froze, the grocery list slipping from my hands. Before I could move, he took a single step toward me, and in that moment, the lights went out. All I could hear was the sound of frantic breathing and an overwhelming sense of dread. I bolted, screaming for Laura as I raced through the store, grabbing at the edges of my sanity. I found her in the aisle, her face ghostly pale, and she was gripping her phone tightly, shaking. "Did you see him?" she whispered, and I nodded, still reeling from the terror of being so close to something I couldn't explain. In the following days, I made the hard choice to go to the police, warily explaining the situation. They brushed it off, saying it could be a prank, but something in my gut told me otherwise. Then, without warning, Laura disappeared. One minute she was there, and then she was gone, spilling laughter and warmth into the world, and the next, it was like she had never existed. My heart ached, frantically searching for signs of her in her usual hangouts, social media, anything, and every night I returned to my darkened apartment, guilt gnawing at my mind like the predator it had become. I finally reached out to Danny one last time, hoping against hope that he would tell me where she was, but all I got was a deadpan "You should have stayed out of it." It was a message so straightforward it cut through me, and desperation consumed me as I tried tracing back everything that had happened. It finally hit me: every dark turn we took led back to him. I couldn't let it go, and so, the next Thursday, I found myself standing outside his apartment, too many unanswered questions pulling me toward confrontation. I knocked on the door. I didn't care if I appeared insane. The door creaked open, revealing him, a sly grin stretching across his face. "Thought you might come," he said, stepping aside to let me in, as if he planned this all along. When I stepped inside, the stench hit me like a freight train. "What's wrong with you?" I managed, feeling sick. There were notes scattered everywhere, torn photographs plastered on walls, the evidence of his obsession. I saw Laura's face among them, eyes wide in terror, and it felt like my entire world collapsed. He turned to me, eyes gleaming. "She made me do this. If you had just let me have her, none of this would have happened." I staggered backward in horror as he reached for something behind him. Was it a knife? But I dipped sideways, ducking and sprinting for the door. I burst outside, adrenaline propelling me forward, and just as I neared the stairs, I heard him call after me, a low chuckle echoing through the hallway. "See you soon." I never found Laura. The police still refused to believe me. Danny is still out there, lurking, with secrets that threaten to break through the cracks of reality. As for me, I live in fear every day that he'll find me, too, because I know what he did, and he's not done yet. So, AITA for refusing to set my friend up ever again? I guess I'll never know, as I am too afraid of what darkness lies within the heart of those you think you know. The truth is, I simply can't afford to find out. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation where I'd have to confront my boyfriend's aunt over a Coachella ticket, but here I am, sitting on this dingy couch, heart racing as the realization of what just transpired washes over me like a tidal wave. It all started innocently enough. My boyfriend, Jake, had promised me a magical weekend filled with music, friends, and memories after saving up for months to attend the festival, and when I casually mentioned that I'd be bringing my best friend Sarah along too, Jake's excitement turned into something else entirely. He had a pretty big family, and while I loved spending time with them, his Aunt Linda was a piece of work, horribly intrusive and always looking for ways to reap the benefits of being part of the family. So when she sidled up to me at dinner last week, flashing her overly bright smile and the glimmer of something sinister in her eyes, I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Oh, sweetie, how nice for you to go to Coachella. I'd love to see what all the fuss is about," she cooed, her voice dripped with mock sincerity. I didn't think much of it at first, but that Saturday morning when I reached for my ticket to send to Sarah, my stomach dropped. It was gone. I frantically searched every corner of my room, thinking I'd simply misplaced it, but deep down, I knew. I could feel her eyes watching me during dinner, lingering a little longer when she asked, and I gleefully explained how I'd managed to snag a ticket against the odds. It felt awful admitting it to Jake, but he was just as angry as I was. He assured me we'd confront her together. So, the following Sunday, after pacing back and forth, rehearsing a dozen ways to address the theft, we finally knocked on her door. I mean, I never wanted to escalate the situation, but when she opened the door in her threadbare pajamas, looking more disheveled than usual, and when I said, "Aunt Linda, we need to talk about the ticket," her expression shifted from surprise to amusement, and then to smugness, like she held all the cards in this game that I barely understood. "Oh sweetheart, did you really think you'd get away with that? A Coachella ticket? You should have known I'd take it. It's nothing personal, it's just business," she said matter-of-factly, as if she were discussing the weather. An icy pit formed in my stomach as the earlier thrill of my impending trip dissipated into sheer disbelief. "You can't be serious. You're stealing from your own family." "That's messed up," I managed to choke out, but she waved her hand dismissively, her laughter echoing in that cramped entryway. That's when I snapped. "I could call the cops on you, Linda. Stealing a ticket is still a crime," I spat, regretting my harsh tone a moment later, but the truth hung in the air, and I could tell it hit her harder than I expected. The lightheartedness faded as something darker tightened around her eyes, and for a brief moment, it felt as if shadows shifted within her soul, revealing fractured intentions. "You really want to take this higher?" she asked, amusement gone, replaced by a low, chill-inducing whisper. My palms became clammy. I mean, I hadn't actually wanted to threaten her or anything, but there was something twisted about the way she responded, like she was unbothered and yet simmering beneath the surface. Without waiting for my reply, she slammed the door shut, leaving Jake and me standing there in utter disbelief. The drive home was numbingly silent, but the tension hung between us like a potential storm on the horizon. A week passed and our Coachella dreams began to fade into bitter memories, and that's when I received a text, "I hope you're ready for me to spoil your weekend." I felt a wave of anger mixed with dread as I read the message again. Who the hell did she think she was? Jake urged me to let it go, saying it wasn't worth the trouble, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Aunt Linda was more than just a quirky family member with questionable morals. The night before we were set to leave, I couldn't sleep. The thought of stepping into a festival atmosphere while knowing she might be lurking around transformed my excitement into anxiety. I smashed my phone down when another notification lit up, followed by a loud, menacing snicker cascading from the darkness outside my window. A memory flickered to life, the way that Linda gazed at me, almost as if she enjoyed my discomfort. That very night, Sarah, who had driven in from out of town, texted that she was running late due to roadwork, and in no time, Jake and I were ready to go, practically bouncing off the walls despite the aura of dread contradicting our enthusiasm. The sun beat down mercilessly as we drove to the venue, the vibe electric with anticipation, yet I couldn't shake the feeling something was off. Glancing around, jitters coursed through me until we finally parked and made our way through the crowd, the bass vibrating beneath our feet, the air thick with the sweet aroma of festival food and excitement. Music filled the air as we found our place among friends, but as the first band took the stage, I felt someone watching me from the edge of the crowd. My heart raced as I turned. There, mingling with festival goers, was Aunt Linda, looking as innocent as ever, rocking her signature flower crown. Panic clouded my mind. Did she come to ruin my experience, or was it some twisted intervention? I nudged Jake and pointed. What the hell is she doing here? He turned sharply. Give it a rest, she's probably just enjoying herself, but I wasn't convinced. I spent the next few sets watching her from afar, and the longer I stared, the more she appeared to embody this harbinger of chaos, weaving through groups of people and then disappearing into the crowd. It was only during the third set that everything escalated. Sarah and I were dancing, lost in the rhythms, but suddenly I felt a hand grab my shoulder, yanking me back. I spun around, ready for a confrontation, when I came face to face with Linda, her eyes glinting with something dark, her mouth twisted in a strange smile. You didn't think you'd get here unscathed, did you? She sneered, her voice a sickly sweet whisper. My stomach dropped as Jake rushed to my side, anger flaring in his chest, but before he could say anything, she leaned in closer, her breath cold against my ear and said, You should have kept your mouth shut, honey, you have no idea who you're dealing with. This is my playground. Then she slipped into the crowd, leaving us stunned, my heart racing in my chest. I felt sick. Who was this woman that she turned a simple estrangement into something so sinister? I wanted to enjoy this festival more than anything, but the gnawing sense of danger lingered like a shadow, overshadowing even the brightest moments. The night stretched on, and hours passed, filled with intoxicating music and laughter tinged with anxiety until finally, just when I thought I could breathe easy again, I turned and spotted Linda once more, lurking, but this time she was speaking to a group of security guards. Fear coursed through me. There was no doubt in my mind this woman was plotting something malicious. Within moments, murmurs began spreading through the crowd, and then chaos erupted. Someone had punched one of the security guards, and as bodies began to flee, I saw Jake look toward me, panic etched across his face. We have to go now, he yelled, and we made a run for it along with hundreds of others, the bliss of the festival engulfed by sheer terror. I glanced back and saw Linda, somehow reveling in the pandemonium she'd unleashed, and it hit me, the ticket, the threat, the laughter, they'd all been part of some twisted game she played, and now I was a player in her insane reality. As we slipped past the barriers and swarmed into the parking lot, the echoes of sirens neared with each step. Where did she go? I gasped, searching the crowd, but my entire body screamed that this wasn't over. We piled into the car, and although Jake fumbled with keys, I stared into the chaos we'd just escaped. Aunt Linda's insane, I breathed. He nodded, eyes fixed on the growing crowd around us. Just when we thought we'd slipped away, my phone buzzed again with a text, You can't escape me. I'll find you, sweetheart. That night, every ounce of excitement was completely drained from me, and as we sat parked outside our apartment, I realized this Coachella trip had turned into a nightmare filled with threats woven into memories, and Aunt Linda was only the beginning. I never thought I'd say this, but I might actually have to call the cops. I never thought that allowing my mother to host Thanksgiving dinner at my house would lead to such chaos, but here we are, 3 days away from the holiday, and all I can think about is how I may have opened the door to something unspeakable. My wife, Sarah, is heavily pregnant with our 4th child and has been feeling exhausted and anxious, so I thought it would be a kind gesture to let my mother take over the cooking this year. She's been insisting on bringing her classic turkey and stuffing for as long as I can remember, and although my mother is eccentric, let's just say her ideas about food are unique, she promised she wouldn't do anything too outlandish this time. Since our first Thanksgiving together as a married couple, I've always felt the pressure of blending our families in the presence of holiday cheer, and Sarah has been under so much stress already. But as the day approaches, I've started to notice things that make my skin crawl. It began when my mother presented a package of what she claimed were secret spices for the turkey, each ingredient labeled with cryptic names. She explained they were traditional family recipes passed down for generations, but there was something eerie about the way her eyes sparkled when she mentioned them, like a wolf revealing its meal after a successful hunt. Sarah, noticing my discomfort, told me to ease up and let my mom have her fun, but late at night, when it was just the three of us and the kids were asleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I could hear my mother moving around the kitchen, testing her concoctions and humming strange lullabies that felt foreign, even menacing, in their melody. The scent of the spices wafting into the living room was strangely intoxicating, laced with an undertone that made me feel both dizzy and anxious, and every time I tried to confront her, she dismissed my concerns with a wave of her hand, claiming it was all in good spirit and for the family. It was around this same time that I found our youngest, Emma, talking to what she described as an invisible friend who made her giggle loudly at odd moments. Kids her age often have imaginary friends, but when I pried deeper, Emma's stories took on a bizarre, unsettling tone. "He says Grandma's food is magic and that we're all invited to dinner," she'd say, her eyes wide with a mix of excitement and trepidation, as if she were caught between a dream and a nightmare. As Thanksgiving Day neared, my anxiety spiraled, and it didn't help that Sarah was increasingly sleepy and withdrawn, unable to shake what she described as a lingering fog in her mind. It was then that I went to look for my mother, only to find her hunched over the kitchen table, her fingers dripping with purple-red juices that I didn't want to think too hard about. "I'm just preparing the turkey, sweetie, don't worry," she said with an unsettling grin that stretched across her face, revealing crooked teeth that seemed to glisten with something unholy. I saw a glimpse of the turkey. Its skin was unnaturally glossy, and there were an array of small, round wounds where the feathers had once lain, looking almost like a string of pearls encased in the fleshy, glistening skin. "Where did you get this?" I uttered, trying to keep my throat from constricting too tightly. My mother looked back at me, her expression shifting from affectionate to something feral, and though she didn't answer, the air in the room thickened with a kind of infectious dread. I stumbled backward, grappling with the chill creeping up my spine, convinced my mother was losing her mind. Before I could leave, she whispered, "They'll love it, they were waiting for you," and my heart raced painfully at the insinuation. It was without question a breaking point. I confronted Sarah, suggesting we uninvite my mother, but her response left me stunned. "Let her do this, please. I think I need it. I don't want to deal with anything else right now." I pestered her for weeks, but with that hint of desperation in her voice, I felt backed into a corner. Thanksgiving came, and the atmosphere was rife with tension. I attempted to remain composed as friends and family arrived, but a discomforting strain hung over us, a dark cloud shrouding the festivities. The food, glistening in all its macabre beauty, began to arrive, turkey adorned with crimson glimmers, sides overflowing with vibrant colors, the very air filled with an intoxicating sweetness that made my head spin. As we sat at the table, I eyed the kids, who eagerly hovered over the food, whispering secrets amongst one another, fueled by some silent pact I couldn't grasp. I watched in horror as they took their first bites, followed by delightful gasps and soft giggles, every forkful seeming to ignite their spirits to heights I'd never seen before, yet there was an edge of something primal in their delight. The adults, too, were transfixed, chatting joyfully as if no one else could sense the creeping chill between us, the hallucinations in the corners of visions that twisted laughter into darker sounds. My chest tightened as I felt my mother's gnarled fingers brush against my shoulder, and she leaned in to whisper, "They told me this day would come, that all would be well. Don't you see, this is how we keep the magic alive?" I felt ice coil around my heart, the ominous weight of her words settling deep within me. The moment Emma leaned across the table, her smile too wide, too predatory, to announce that Grandma's magic tastes so good. And my body began to betray me, the urge to scream battling against my instinct to protect. And then, just as quickly, I felt my resolve waver, almost collapsing under the deliciously dark enchantment that twisted through the air like invisible threads binding us all. That evening blurred between reality and terror, all of us trapped in a dreamscape where joy danced alongside malevolence. I realized with a jolt that the children were not simply enjoying a Thanksgiving feast, something dangerous was unfolding. Before I could act, the lights flickered, plunging us into shadows, and as confusion reigned, Sarah's voice echoed through the darkness, "We're all just pieces in her game," tinged with an eerie, knowing calmness, as if she were in on a secret knowing I could not comprehend. At that moment, I felt an exhilarating thrill of the macabre awakening deep inside, tearing at the ties of sanity as I become a spectator in this grotesque festival, watching my family become enraptured, my mother's soft laughter raking through the cracks of normality, as they surrendered to a feast that was anything but ordinary. I could hear a soft chant rise from the children, their words swirling like whispers carried on the wind, and that night, as darkness settled, I understood that I had failed my family. What I had thought to be a simple holiday dinner had turned into a horrifying rite, where every bite tightened the grip of something lurking, hungry, at the edges of my world, drawn in by a maternal force that would stop at nothing to ensure that this Thanksgiving would never end. When my husband, Josh, died unexpectedly, a part of me shattered, twisting grief and disbelief into a bitter knot that settled heavy in my chest. We had only been married 5 years, but they had been the happiest years of my life. Josh was everything, my best friend, my partner, and the light in my life. Losing him felt like a slow suffocation, a waking nightmare that consumed me as I navigated funeral arrangements and the aftermath of his sudden passing. His mother, Elaine, had always been a complicated figure in our lives. She was supportive yet overbearing, and although Josh struggled with their relationship, I tried to foster peace between them. But after he was gone, that dynamic morphed into something else entirely. When I received the life insurance payout, a staggering 6-figure sum, Elaine immediately insisted that she needed half to cover the funeral costs she'd put on her credit card. I was taken aback. There was no discussion of her covering it or me paying her back later, just a demand as if her procession of grief gave her authority over my choices. I had expected tears, shared memories, and perhaps even a quiet moment where we could both remember Josh, but instead, a dark shadow hung over her eyes while she openly calculated her financial expectations. I remember being at the funeral, standing by his casket, the cool air heavy with an unspoken tension. Elaine had taken charge, orchestrating the details as if it were her final say in a business transaction rather than a memorial, and I can't help but wonder if this was her way of grasping control in a world spiraling out of our hands. With every interaction, her disappointment in me deepened. I wasn't mourning in the way she'd expected, perhaps because, beneath my sorrow, I felt the stirrings of anger that soon flared into resentment. When she demanded I give her money, something in me snapped. "It's not your money to demand, Elaine," I hissed, the words spilling out encased in bitterness. Her face turned ash-white, an expression that danced between disbelief and outrage. I thought about the moments I shared with Josh, the joy we built together, and the memories we created as a couple. It felt wrong to surrender that to her. I finally decided to pay for the memorial and cover the remaining costs with the life insurance money, my own damn money, from a plan we had for our future, one I was now simply trying to navigate without him, in a world that felt cold and hollow. I figured it was my right to choose how to honor him, to be the one who decides where that money went, but that wasn't how Elaine saw it. Over the following weeks, she became more persuasive in her demands, trying to warp my sense of obligation by draping her words in grief. "You don't want to forget Josh, do you? You want to honor him," she would say, her voice dripping with concern that felt more like a threat than kindness. I felt like I was being cornered in an emotional chess game, the pieces tipped in her favor. I watched her weave conversations filled with guilt while describing how hard it was raising Josh alone as a single parent, as if this somehow implied I owed her tribute for his very existence. I couldn't shake the feeling that her grief was more about her than about Joshua as I desperately sought the support of friends and family. Most didn't take my side, they echoed Elaine's logic, making me feel like a villain for wanting to claim what was rightfully mine, especially when they'd hear her sob stories. The nights that followed were filled with anxiety, guilt gnawing under my skin while I replayed those unbearable conversations. I felt trapped, like a prisoner in my own house, constantly haunted by my inability to bend to her will. One evening, as I was sorting through Josh's things, a muted ping from my phone snatched my attention. It was Elaine, with a photo of the blurred headstone at the cemetery, eerily illuminated by a waxing moon. Beneath it, she wrote, "This is where my only son sleeps, and you're the reason I have to suffer alone." I could feel the walls closing in around me, the pressure rising as I tried to breathe through waves of panic and regret. Who's the real monster here? I thought and countered my discomfort with a cold resentment. In that moment of blind rage, I decided to take a step farther. If she wanted to make this a game of emotional leverage, I would turn the tables. A few days later, as I watched her elaborate on her grief during family dinners to anyone who would listen, I gathered strength. I made plans to take a trip. I turned the life insurance into an opportunity. I booked a getaway to the mountains where Josh and I had always dreamed of spending a weekend, without a care in the world. It was a sanctuary for healing, and I was desperately clinging to memories of the man I loved. My phone buzzed frantically days before I was supposed to leave. It was Elaine, demanding to know where I was going. "It's none of your business," I retorted. Instead of caving under her barrage of guilt-laden messages, I dug deeper into my anger. I left, erasing the emotional strings Elaine had hoped to bind me with. The mountains embraced me like a lover, and there I found solace. I spent time reflecting on who Josh was, what he wanted, and how much he had fought to keep a distance from his chaotic family dynamics. A week passed in blissful isolation before I returned home to a barrage of voicemail and texts detailing accusations of theft, betrayal, and loss of family. I moved through my own fog of despair, waking nightmares that swirled in my mind as I listened. That's when it hit me. I was at the center of this conflict, one that would not fade away. It culminated one last terrible afternoon when I received a summons in the mailbox addressed in her meticulous handwriting. Her betrayal now turned legal. The walls I had hoped to reinforce around my grief began to shake as dread seeped into every corner of my heart. I never intended to stop her from grieving, and I never wanted the insurance money to be the focal point of a battle for something as precious as memory. But looking back now, I recognize that Elaine didn't just want money, she wanted control over the narrative of her son's life, even in death. I am left to contend with the guilt that wraps around me like a shroud, yet, somewhere deep within, I know Josh would want me to find my own peace, and perhaps there's more to life than the pain of losing someone, especially someone who had to be let go, regardless of the bones they left behind. As I share this, I wonder, AITA for wanting to keep the money that was my lifeline to a man whose life I cherished more than anything? Perhaps it doesn't matter, not anymore. What matters now is confronting the echoes of a love that once lit my way and deciding how best to carry that light forward, alone. I was never the kind of person who took pleasure in stirring the pot, but the strange events that unfolded on my parents' land last autumn left me questioning everything I thought I knew about our little corner of the world, and myself. You see, every morning, I take my dog, Max, for a stroll along the well-trodden paths through the woods behind our house, an area usually filled with the comforting sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls, but October was different. The chill in the air held an edge, and the atmosphere turned thick with tension. Hunting season had begun, and with it came whispers of unease among the townsfolk. My parents warned me to steer clear of the usual hunting spots, but to be honest, I thought they were overreacting. After all, this was our family land, and what right did a couple of hunters have to dictate where I could walk my dog? 2 weeks into October, as orange leaves fluttered down like nature's confetti, I decided to ignore my parents' cautious advice. It was a crisp Saturday morning when I leashed up Max and headed out towards the back trails. I felt empowered, determined to reclaim my daily ritual, but as we strolled deeper into the woods, a creeping sensation clawed at my spine. Maybe it was just unease from my parents' warnings, maybe it was simple instinct, but something felt off. The woods suddenly seemed alive with unspoken secrets. My heart raced as we rounded a bend in the path and I noticed a tree stand, a crude wooden platform nestled high among the branches of an ancient oak, unmoving but for the sway of the tree. Something made me hesitate as I scanned the area, watching. An irrational part of me considered turning back, but then I saw him, a figure clad in camo, sitting stoically within the confines of the stand, a hunting rifle resting against his knee. He didn't seem to notice us at first, but as I pulled Max closer, I caught a glimpse of what lay beneath that camouflage. His eyes, cold and calculating, focused sharply on me. My skin prickled as the tension in the air intensified, and Max whimpered beside me, ever the sensitive companion. I made the snap decision to keep walking, hoping that if I ignored him, he would do the same. I felt foolish, but it was just a tree stand and a hunter. I had every right to be there. Yet, no sooner had we strolled past the tree than a sharp snap echoed through the quiet woods, like a twig being crushed underfoot. My heart dropped into my stomach. I turned to see the hunter had shifted slightly, almost as if he were adjusting his grip on the rifle, but something felt incredibly wrong. There was a predatory quality to his calm demeanor, a languid patience, like a lion sizing up an unsuspecting gazelle. I picked up the pace, clenching the leash tighter as a wave of primal fear washed over me. Max trotted beside me, seemingly sensing the change in energy, his tail low and his ears alert. I didn't dare look back. I was on my parents' land, I reminded myself again and again, but it was no longer comforting. The sensation of being hunted kept gnawing at my thoughts, and dread mingled with the crisp autumn air as every snap of a twig sent my pulse racing. Just before we reached the clearing, a voice called out, gravelly and low, shattering the suffocating silence and sending a jolt through my body. "Hey! You shouldn't be here." It was the hunter. I could feel his eyes boring into my back as I quickened my pace toward the fence that marked the boundaries of our property. "This area's reserved. Get lost." I didn't stop or respond, my pulse hammering in my ears, and then, impossibly, I heard a low chuckle, a sound so sinister it might as well have been a growl. That chuckle echoed in my mind long after it faded into the distance, and with it, a realization began to settle like a weight in my chest. I was in danger far beyond what I'd anticipated. I reached the boundary of our land and felt the familiar relief wash over me, but when I turned back, instinctively looking for trouble, the tree stand seemed impossibly empty. There was no sign of him. It was as if he had melted away into the shadows of the woods. I didn't sleep well that night. Shadows from where my dreams should have been stalked me, wrestling me deeper into a pit of anxiety. The next day I tried to explain to my parents, but they waved my concerns away as the ramblings of a paranoid child. "People are just doing their thing," my father said over breakfast. "You know how the hunters can get." But I had seen something that twisted at the seams of what normal meant. My instincts screamed at me to stay away from the woods, but part of me felt stubbornly drawn back. I needed to confront whatever specter hovered in those trees. The following weekend, I donned my bravest face and headed out again, this time brimming with anger rather than trepidation. Max was at my side once more as we traversed the path, though I felt every heartbeat thrumming through my veins like a war drum. I glanced towards that tree stand, convinced that somehow, impossibly, he was watching me again. "You hear me?" I shouted into the forest, the bravado masking the fear lacing through me. "You can't scare me off my own land." Silence hung, and though my voice rang back at me, I knew I wasn't alone. The shadows felt thicker, and the chill surging through the air seeped right to my bones. It became a twisted game between us. I walked the path, the sense of being hunted curling around me like a predator, watching, waiting. This went on for weeks, each time edging further and further from rationality, caught in the throes of an unnameable dread. Days turned to weeks and the hunter became more than just an encounter. He was a specter, a nightmare made manifest. I would see him in fleeting glimpses through the trees, a flash of camouflage here, a flicker of movement there. The forest became a stage of lurking terror, and one fateful day, with the sun dipping low and shadows elongating, I finally snapped. I took Max and charged across the clearing directly towards the stand, feeling reckless and defiant. "Show yourself," I yelled, hands shaking, ready to face whatever darkness awaited me. Those cold eyes finally met mine from the lofty height above. He emerged, stepping lightly down, and for the first time, I could see his face, gaunt and unshaven, with a smile that didn't look human, a predatory grin laced with a chaotic glint. "Mighty brave of you to come here," he rasped, his voice dripping with a chilling amusement. "You think you have more claim to this land than I do?" Panic exploded in my gut, overwhelming my ability to reason as I took a step backward, but my dog growled, stepping protectively in front of me. I pressed on instinctively wanting to protect him as well. "This is my family's land," I spat, though doubts gnawed at my resolve. "You're nothing but a trespasser." Each word sliced through the air like a knife, but he merely laughed, dark and unrelenting. "I've seen you walking here, dog and all. You think I just go away because you're here? This is my haunt now." The way he said haunt struck a chord deep within. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't turn my back on this monster. "You don't own this place," I rotated, letting anger guide me through fear, "and you're not welcome here." His smile widened, a rictus that hung heavy in the air like some malevolent omen. "You think you can keep me away?" He snarled dangerously, and that puzzle that had haunted me weeks fell into place. This wasn't just about hunting, it was a war over territory, dominance, the very essence of survival. I knew I had to escape, that lingering fear curling around my throat as I found a moment of doubt. He was just a hunter, surely he wouldn't cross any lines? But just then, the echo of footsteps drew near, and I turned to see my parents coming down the path. Relief flooded through me until I saw the confusion in their eyes. "What's going on?" my father called, but the hunter merely cocked his head, an utterly soulless look in his gaze. This land should have been theirs long ago, he whispered venomously, but sometimes, the strong take what they want. I felt my breath seize in my throat. I didn't know what I could do. He might have been a man, but he loomed larger than life, a specter of dread that had haunted my every waking moment. Run, I shouted at my parents, desperately trying to shield them as panic clawed at my chest, but they were rooted. Fear had snagged them as much as it had ensnared me. What are you doing? My mother cried, but that devil's grin sucked the breath from my lungs. I turned to Max, and as if sensing the impending danger, the little dog barked furiously, a fierce protector as he lunged toward the figure that towered over us. And in that instant, I knew, I wasn't the only one he wanted to claim. Everything twisted around me then, screams pierced the stillness as my mind spiraled into chaos, fragmenting like an old, broken mirror, clawing back toward the safety of the woods I had defended in the first place. But what had once felt like refuge now echoed with the sinister knowledge that the hunter would always be hungering for more. As night fell, my parents finally understood, and I was left racing while the woods closed in behind us, a chilling reminder that in this game of survival, sometimes stepping forward meant crossing a line you could never uncross. We might have escaped with our lives, but the terror of that encounter clings to me still, a constant reminder of the haunting truth. Sometimes, it's not just the land that gets claimed, but our very own sanity that follows suit. And every now and then, when the wind howls just right, I can still hear that terrible laughter echoing through the woods, reminding me that I wasn't just trespassing on land but wandering into a realm where the hunter never really stops hunting. AITA for requesting an explanation for my money being spent without my consent? It started with a casual text from my sister, Emma, asking about some weird charges on my bank statement. At first, I thought she was just being paranoid, but that changed when I saw the numbers myself. I had already been on edge ever since I started to notice odd things around my apartment, items misplaced, food disappearing from my fridge, and the eerie sensation that someone was watching me. At first, I brushed it off as stress from my recently taxing job, but as the charges piled up and Emma discovered 4 mysterious withdrawals totaling over $1,000, I began to quake with a fear that flared deep within me. When I confronted Emma, she appeared genuinely concerned, urging me to monitor my accounts, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something foul was lurking underneath. It wasn't just my money at stake but possibly my very security. One night, frayed with the tension, I decided to take action and installed a couple of security cameras around my apartment, small, inconspicuous, and just enough to give me peace of mind. Days passed, and everything seemed normal, until one evening I reviewed the footage and what I saw made my stomach drop, an unknown figure slipping through my back door, their movements too fluid, too practiced. It was a mess of jerky limbs, a shadow that crept between comfort and chaos. My heart raced as I flipped through the clips, finding evidence of this intrusion every night, a routine that felt like a sinister ballet played out on my own floor. I found myself losing sleep over the thought of this uninvited guest, replaying the footage over and over until I began to recognize patterns. He'd always visit around 2 a.m., rifling through my belongings, sometimes even holding my credit card, his face obscured by a cheap mask, but his hands, oh God, those hands, were skeletal, fingers darting like spiders, and it chilled my blood to watch him swipe my card for groceries, for God knows what with my hard-earned cash. I decided I had to do something drastic. Gathering my courage, I called a private investigator who specialized in cases of stalking and theft. After explaining my situation, he seemed just as perplexed, yet assured me he'd find the truth. He assured me I was not alone in this battle, and with my permission, he installed discreet cameras and started monitoring the situation. The next evening, I was jolted from sleep by a loud creak, the unmistakable sound of my back door swinging open. Heart pounding, I turned on the monitor to see the masked figure once more, but this time he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was another figure, a woman in a flowing white dress, her long hair cascading in waves that concealed her face. They were conversing, low murmurs spilling into the silent night, and for a moment, I could have sworn one of them gestured towards my camera. Was this all just a sick prank? Suddenly, the two turned, and I could see the woman reach out, trailing her fingers over the edge of a knife she pulled from her waistband before wrapping her hand around the figure's wrist. Something deep in my gut warned me that they were no ordinary thieves. This was a premeditated act, some grotesque performance playing out in my living room. I felt paralyzed, half wishing to flee while simultaneously entranced by the surreal nature of it all. Just then, the woman looked directly into the camera and I swear she smiled, a wide, toothy grin that shattered my nerves into a million pieces. The following days descended into pure madness. I began receiving letters slipped under my door, the kind of letters that feel like a taunt from an unseen adversary. They spoke in riddles and whispered of my past, old secrets I thought I had buried alive, tales of debts I never acknowledged, family issues long resolved, and a chilling prophecy about how my curiosity would be my undoing. Night after night, I received strange deliveries, packages filled with personal items from my childhood, acquired during those hellish break-ins but intended for some twisted purpose only they understood. Then everything came crashing down on an ordinary Thursday evening when I received a chilling text from Emma. "I think they know about us," it read, accompanied by a picture of her home, the same woman from my video standing just outside her window, a finger pressed to her lips, as if to silence her. Panic surged through my body, and I dialed her number, begging to know if she was okay, but when she answered, her voice carried a tremor. "They came to my house, Jamie, asking about you. They said you were supposed to pay the price." Tears streamed down my face, clutching at my phone as she continued, "They told me to tell you to stop investigating or else." The call ended abruptly. I stood in my kitchen, staring blankly at the wall, dread choking me. After that, my world spiraled rapidly into an abyss of paranoia. Every sound morphed into a threat, shadows danced menacingly at the corners of my vision, and the silence was punctuated by an awareness I wished I could escape. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't breathe, trapped in an existential maze of horror. One fateful night, I mustered the courage to confront the twisted reality of my life. I figured if they wanted me, I'd meet them on my terms. I set up a final trap, luring them in with the results of my mounting searches, fake articles about how to win the lottery and the secret to eternal youth. I awoke just past midnight to the unmistakable sound of shuffling by my window. I could barely breathe as I crawled toward the security camera, heart racing, praying one final act would unveil the truth behind all of this. They slipped inside, the woman's laugh cutting through the insistent quiet as she plucked treasures from my drawers, memories, trinkets, possessions that were once dear to me. And then she turned, the mask slipping off her head to expose a face I knew all too well, my own twisted grin reflected in a funhouse mirror, stripped of its humanity. And there, standing beside her, was the very figure I had panicked over, his presence dark and foreboding. I realized, in that heart-stopping moment, that they were me, manifestations of every sin I'd ever committed rising to envelop me, whispering sweet promises of freedom if only I would embrace the chaos. At that moment, my fate lay in their hands, their hollow words chilling me to the bone as they reminded me, "You always wanted to know." It was a red-eye flight from Los Angeles to New York, and after hours of cramped leg space and the constant hum of the engines, I was relieved to finally feel the plane start its descent. As we touched down, the anticipation of reuniting with friends for a long-awaited trip filled me with excitement, but that joy quickly dimmed when the plane rolled to a stop and the chaotic symphony of kids crying and parents shushing them erupted around me. Just as I unbuckled my seatbelt, a mother in the row ahead of me started shouting at her child, a little boy, maybe 5 or 6, who had transformed himself into a living tornado of rage and defiance. He was poised to unleash a tantrum that could rival any natural disaster, kicking the seat in front of him with relentless fury, and then it happened. The mother, rather than reassuring him, began to scream, and her voice pierced through the dull noise of the cabin like a siren, as if the whole plane had become a stage for their performance. When the seatbelt sign turned off and the doors opened, I stood up eagerly, ready to move forward, when this little monster darted into the aisle, throwing his arms up and screaming as if he believed he could bring down the whole aircraft with just his cries. Corners of people's faces contorted with annoyance as frazzled parents tried to reason with the child while he stomped his feet, flailing like a banshee. In my peripheral vision, I noticed an older man behind me. He looked ready to snap, his patience already worn thin by the chaotic scene unfolding before us. As he shouted at the kid to stop acting like that and to get out of the way, I felt an unfamiliar pull of anger rise within me, an unyielding impulse ignited by worn-out anxieties of my own. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was standing there, frozen in indecision, 1,000 possibilities passing through my mind. Should I step aside? Should I yell too? But then an audacious thought crossed my mind: why should I? It wasn't my child throwing a fit, and why was the rest of the world suffering under this child's tantrum? As the tantrum escalated, I stood my ground stubbornly. The boy began crying harder, his wails echoing through the cabin as he kicked his little feet against the aisles, making it impossible for anyone to get past. I watched as parents attempted to calm him down, but their efforts were futile. The little boy's pleading screams devolved into a cacophony of noise that seemed to seep into my very bones. I finally whispered, "You've got to be kidding me," under my breath, just as the elderly man behind me shoved my shoulder gently, signaling me to move aside, but instead, I clenched my teeth and grit my teeth, unwilling to give an inch. "Move," he exclaimed, hitching his backpack and glaring at the kid as if he could force him to cooperate through sheer will. It was surreal watching two adults struggle against the manic outbursts of a child, and in a fit of anger, I turned around and snapped at the man to back off, that this had nothing to do with me, and I wouldn't be the one to budge. My voice was louder than I intended, and a wave rippled through the crowd like I had unleashed some invisible force that suddenly everyone had felt. It silenced the room momentarily, and the little boy looked at me wide-eyed, screen-printed with confusion. The mother, no longer raising her voice, stood still with a glazed expression, her hands frozen on either side of her son, the heat of shame and frustration radiating off her. I was taken aback, realizing I was now at the center of this whirlwind, a moment where rage intertwined with guilt as my heart raced in my chest. I felt a sickening mix of satisfaction and regret, unsure if I had escalated the situation or somehow brought relief. I had thought I was being resolute, but instead, I found myself entangled in an emotional disaster. The tension in the cabin thickened, and as the seconds stretched into forever, the boy finally broke. He let out one last defiant scream and surprisingly spun around, sprinting back to his seat, still crying as loud as his lungs could manage, while parents finally scooped their children up and started to clear the aisle, moving around me like I was an immovable object in a world of chaos. But then something terrifying happened. As he settled back into his seat, I suddenly felt a rush of nausea sweep over me, an all too familiar feeling that accompanied moments of pure dread, a thought creeping into my mind that mirrored the chaos. I hadn't just deemed that child a nuisance, had I? I was now a villain in this story, solidified in place and surrounded by sympathetic glares from onlookers who had witnessed my outburst. Words flared hot at the tip of my tongue as I turned to the older man, a stranger who I now saw as a comrade in this blender of emotions. "I'm sorry," I stammered, a futile attempt to mend the invisible rift that had formed, but he laughed, a low, gravely laugh, and nodded, almost approvingly. "You didn't deserve that. No one did. You're not their babysitter," he replied, causing me to feel both relieved and more lost than ever. It dawned on me in that moment, this whole shambolic episode of human suffering was not only about the child, it was about me as well, but the more I dissected it in my head, the more I knew my reaction was rooted in my own tumultuous past. What I thought was just an inane airplane encounter was turning into a dissection of my own character weaknesses. I had endured far worse moments long before needing an emotional outlet against the harrowing memories that had seeped into my mind over time, of feeling trapped, of feeling like I couldn't escape my own emotional dysfunction that had caused echoes of laughter and anger to crumble into one another through time. It wasn't just about parenting, it was about trauma. This innocent child had opened a can that I wasn't ready to confront, and suddenly a flash of clarity struck me like lightning. What if I needed to be shaken for a reason? Luckily, as the line began to move, I found myself taking my first tentative step toward the exit, lingering behind the furious mother and her misbehaving child, drifting just far enough back to feel safe yet still close enough to engage in the raw humanity of what had unfolded. I made it to the door just behind them, and when we finally stepped into the cool air of the terminal, I caught a glimpse of the boy, still ensnared in his mother's frustrated grip. Their dynamic struck me as bittersweet, two broken souls meeting at an intersection of despair. At the last moment, I realized that the world isn't simply black and white. Every outburst is a story, every tantrum wrapped in layers of the unexplained, and in that instant, I forgave us all, even myself, for simply being human. With every part of me still unsettled, I merged back into the flow of travelers, carrying the weight of that awkward confrontation, caught in a web of empathy that lingered in the air, a breath away from devastation and understanding, and as I walked through the throng of people, I hesitated for just a moment to turn back, half expecting to catch the boy's eye, but instead, I found only the fleeting silhouettes of silhouettes blending into the crowd of hurried passengers, their lives intersecting through the storm, never to meet again. Thanksgiving had always been a family affair in my house, but this year felt different. This year, my husband eagerly announced his friend might be bringing her dog to dinner. Her dog, a strange hybrid mix of some kind of terrier and things I couldn't even identify, had a penchant for mischief, and as someone who had witnessed the aftermath of its chaotic visits in the past, I immediately felt a chill creep down my spine. From the moment I said no to the canine inclusion, an unseen tension crackled through the air like static electricity, my husband's face darkened, and a silenced argument bubbled beneath the surface. It's just a dog, he'd insisted, but I couldn't shake the memories of Thanksgivings past where that little beast had devoured half of my cousin's pie and shredded a pillow beyond recognition while the adults were too distracted by football to notice. Besides, there was something unsettlingly unnatural about how that dog would stare at me from the corner of the room, its dark eyes boring into my soul, as though it were waiting, watching, plotting. In the days leading up to the dinner, I was met with accusations of being a dog-phobe, and while I had nothing against dogs in general, there was something profoundly off about this one. When Thanksgiving Day finally arrived, I found myself setting the table with a sense of dread, the silence of my reluctance hanging thick in the air. As my husband and his friend arrived, I noticed she wore this bizarre, almost victorious grin, as if the anticipation of chaos fueled her swagger. "You didn't really think she would have to leave her dog behind, did you?" She chuckled, throwing me a look that sent a shiver down my spine. The door swung open, and Toby, a name the dog bizarrely longed for, pranced into the house, his small body wiggling eagerly. I felt a knot form in my stomach as it darted around, sniffing everything, as if cataloging my life's most precious belongings. Dinner progressed amid the usual laughter and chatter, but I couldn't focus, my unease festered like a wound. That dog, now settled like a predator on a distant rack of bones, would occasionally fix me with its unsettling gaze, and each time I caught it watching me, the atmosphere warped around us. I started hearing whispers in the shadows, hushed tones that sent an ice-cold tremor through my bones, as if conversations were happening just out of sight, echoing thoughts that were never spoken aloud. The friendly barking morphed into something darker as the hours rolled on, and laughter turned hollow, every cheerful exchange gouging deeper into my consciousness, replacing comfort with creeping dread. At one point, while serving turkey, I looked up only to see Toby at my feet, staring, his pupils dilated to a menacing sliver. In that very moment, the power flickered, plunging us into darkness before the light stubbornly returned, and suddenly it wasn't just the dog watching me, it felt as if something else lurked beneath the surface, hidden yet glaring. My eyes skimmed across the room, grasping for a shred of normalcy, only to lock onto Toby, who now seemed frozen, his body tense, poised as if preparing for something unspeakable. I forced a laugh when my husband and his friend joined me, but everything felt warped, strange, unsettling, a distortion of reality wrapped in familial love. When the dessert arrived, I felt the vibration of panic crawl through my fingertips as I skimmed across the table. I had baked a pumpkin pie my grandmother used to make. Just as I placed the pie down, Toby darted forward like a sprinter at the starting gun, sending the beautiful piece of pie flying to the ground, shattered into an unrecognizable mess. Everyone gasped, laughter dissolving into disbelief as my husband yelled, "Toby, no!" My pulse quickened, and in that instant of chaos, I felt an overwhelming sense of urgency, a silent signal that something was horribly wrong. The dog wasn't just clumsy, he was deliberate, and I desperately shouted, "Get that thing outside!" Something in my voice snapped through the tension, and as Toby was whisked away, I turned to see my husband's friend buckle in response. The joy she'd entered with had morphed into something closer to rage. "What's wrong with you?" she hissed, her voice suddenly low, laced with venom. The rest of the night was a blur of hurried movements and strained silences, the air humid with unspoken tension, until I finally noticed the flickering lights again, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls. The whispers grew, now harsh and chaotic, mocking me, taunting me. I couldn't shake the feeling we were trapped in some cruel play, and that little dog, no, that creature, was pulling the strings. Just as I thought the worst was over, the front door swung open, and I caught sight of Toby again, alone, sitting eerily still on the porch, head cocked at an angle, as if he had a message to deliver. My blood ran cold, an instinctual fear curling within me, and the room fell silent as everyone turned. "Where's your friend?" I choked out, my voice trembling. Just then, the atmosphere shifted, a cloud of apprehension flooded over us, washing away any last ounce of warmth. I glanced at my husband, only to see his face pale, eyes wide with terror. "She's got to be joking, right? She didn't go out there, did she?" he gasped, his mind racing. Time seemed to slow down. I had unintentionally opened a door to something dark and unfathomable, and as panic mounted, I braced myself in silence, a haunting thought spiraling within my mind. What had come into our lives alongside Toby? I kept searching for my husband's friend, but it felt as if she had vanished into the ether, a specter hidden among shadows. My heart raced wildly, the whispers louder now, seemingly orchestrating my descent into dread. I gathered the courage to open the front door, and what I saw snuffed the last flickers of hope from my mind. There, on the porch, was Toby, but the dog wore a face unmistakably adorned with blood, brighter than the crimson hues of falling leaves. What happened next unraveled everything. The shadows conspired, my husband stepped out, and in that instant, the world twisted, the line between human and beast blurred. I stood frozen as a deafening howl pierced the night. The laughter of my family became grotesque, mocking me, pulling me deeper into the oblivion. AITA. My once warm Thanksgiving dinner dissolved into echoes of despair, leaving me to wonder if my simple refusal had unleashed something far darker that lay nestled in the shadows, forever altering our lives, forever horror-drenching my innocent hopes. I need to share something that happened to me recently, and let me tell you, it's been haunting me ever since. I, 24, male, was living with my roommate, Sarah, 22, female, in an apartment that came with limited parking spaces, so we both had a parking pass we needed to display to keep our vehicles safe from being towed. Now, at first, everything seemed fine, but it didn't take long for Sarah's behavior to change. Picture this, every night she'd come home late, sometimes after midnight, after what she said were long shifts at her second job, which I didn't mind until I started noticing that she was leaving her car parked without the pass displayed, even though I'd reminded her at least a dozen times. The first time I noticed it, I told her to park in our designated spot and put the pass up. She waved me off, claiming she would handle it, but as weeks turned into months, the same pattern played out. Her car would sit there, vulnerable and ominously unchecked. I think deep down I knew that ignoring the rules and parking without a pass was what made her feel rebellious, but the threat of a tow loomed over both our heads, and I started to get anxious every time I saw her vehicle in its usual spot without the pass, yet when I confronted her, she'd brush me off like I was the unreasonable one. It escalated the night I saw a tow truck pulling into the lot. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. I could see the driver scanning for offenders, and a chill ran down my spine as I stepped into the hallway. I had a choice to make. I won't lie, I mentally calculated the consequences for both of us, lose her car or confront her again, but knowing Sarah, I could picture her obnoxious eye rolling every time I brought it up, so in that moment, I made the decision. I followed that tow truck. Through the glass door, I watched as they got out and approached her car. My heart raced as I jogged down the stairs, desperate to stop them, but it was already too late. They had it lifted off the ground, and in that moment, I felt a pitiful mix of satisfaction and impending regret. I'd done what I thought was right, but the backlash I anticipated didn't take long to arrive. The next morning, I woke up to find Sarah standing over me, her face pale with anger, and she wasted no time accusing me of being the sole reason her car was gone. I tried to explain how many times I had warned her, how this was purely a consequence of her choices, but she kept accusing me of sabotaging her life and ruining her independence. She even went as far as saying I was taking pleasure in her misfortune. I told her that if she had just followed the rules, we wouldn't be here. That evening, her attempts at getting her car back only compounded her frustration when she learned that her parking pass had been revoked as well. In her fury, she vowed to make my life miserable, and I didn't take her seriously until the creepy stuff started happening. She'd come home late and drop heavy items on the floor to wake me up, blasting music with absurdly loud bass to keep me from sleeping, and I'd find my refrigerator contents rearranged or the dishes dirty when I'd cleaned them just the day before. I thought I was being paranoid until one night, while I was curled up trying to block out the noise with my headphones, I heard her whispering outside my door, saying my name in this eerie sing-song voice that sent chills through my spine. It was as if she was summoning something sinister. I confronted her about it, but she just laughed, saying she was testing my sanity. That was when I began noticing odd occurrences. One of my PS4 games went missing, only to later appear in her room, and when I asked her what it was doing there, she merely shrugged and claimed it found its way. Friends on social media started checking in on me, asking why I looked so tired all the time, and I eventually began sleeping at a friend's house after noticing that she would watch me while I slept, her eyes glimmering strangely in the darkness. I figured I would come clean to anyone that would listen about the awful situation, but my friends thought I was the weird one. I felt isolated, trapped in an apartment that now seemed haunted by her twisted perspective. The turning point came weeks later when I found out that an old mutual friend of ours went missing after reaching out to Sarah, claiming they needed to talk. I immediately tried to talk to her about it, but she just dismissed my concerns, telling me it had nothing to do with her. It was then, in a panic, I decided to check her texts and discovered that she had sent cryptic messages about someone transcending and being free along with a strange timestamp that mirrored the night my friend disappeared. My gut told me something sinister had happened, but the moment she caught me snooping, it was like unleashing Pandora's box. The next day, I woke up to find my belongings trashed. Somehow she snuck in during the night, and I panicked. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but the battery was dead. My heart thudded in my chest as I realized it was only a matter of time before she would come back, and based on what I saw in her texts, I knew I had to escape before my life turned into a living nightmare. The following night, I snuck out, clutching a single duffel bag, but when I reached the parking lot, I was greeted by the harrowing sight of her car parked, with the driver's seat illuminated, even though this time she was nowhere to be seen. I hesitated, but the only way I knew I could protect myself was to leave, so I bolted to my car, only to be peppered by a deafening laughter echoing back from the direction of the apartment. Never have I felt terror like that, knotting through my stomach as I drove through the night, and even now, weeks later, I keep looking over my shoulder, paranoid that she followed me or that somehow, I've let something dark linger, but I still wonder if I went too far by getting her car towed, regardless of whatever captivating madness her psyche had devolved into, and the looming question remains, was I the villain in this twisted tale, or just a victim entangled in a nightmare? I never thought a simple conversation would spiral into a nightmare that would haunt me for years, but here we are. It all started on a Tuesday, a day no different from any other. I was sitting in my homeroom, surrounded by the hum of morning chatter, when Jacob, the class clown with a well-deserved reputation for chaos, turned to me with a smirk that made my stomach drop. Just moments before, I'd finally managed to brush off the whispers about my appearance. My thick glasses and untamed hair were like red flags to my peers, an invitation for their cruelty. But when Jacob said it, I felt the world around me fall away. He called me a slur I thought I'd never hear directed at me, a word loaded with hate and ignorance, so vile it caught in my throat like the last bite of a bad meal. I was frozen, my heart racing, knowing that confronting him would only lead to more taunts, but doing nothing felt like accepting defeat. After class, I couldn't shake off that moment, that bite of venom that whispered to me that I was less deserving of respect simply for being different. Against my better judgment, I decided to go to my guidance counselor, Mrs. Perkins, a woman known for her warm smile and the jam-packed schedule of students desperate to be heard. She was trusted by many, or so I thought. I walked in, rehearsing my words, ensuring that I could convey the hurt without sounding too weak. But as I recounted the story, I noticed her expression shift. It seemed like understanding morphed into disappointment. "You need to speak to him directly," she said, her voice steady yet devoid of compassion, and for a moment, I thought I was being brave, but a sense of dread settled in my chest. The next day, Jacob approached me with his usual swagger, but something was different. There was an intensity in his eyes, an expectation that coiled around us like a noose. I could feel the eyes of my classmates on us, holding their breath like they were waiting for a fight or, worse, a spectacle. Jacob leaned in closer, a sneer on his lips, and whispered, "You told on me, didn't you?" His voice dripped with malice, and in that moment, I realized I had walked into a trap of my own making. As I tried to find my voice, to say that I only wanted to be treated with a shred of dignity, he laughed, a cruel, guttural sound that echoed through the empty hallways, and my stomach twisted in a painful knot. The humiliation built with every laugh that chimed in around me. It was a familiar family of taunts, all mercilessly joining in, and I felt my standing as the target solidifying so solidly that it shook my core. I wanted to deny everything, to crawl into myself and disappear, but Jacob leaned in even closer, taunting me to deny it. I stumbled over my words, unable to fight back, and he responded by tossing out another slur, like throwing a stone into a glass house. His words shattered any belief I had in justice, and the following weeks turned into a blur of relentless bullying, an onslaught that transformed my once quiet school life into a daily battle of survival. The more I tried to advocate for myself, the worse it got. Whispers crept into the cafeteria, photoshopped images emerged on social media, and suddenly I was the joke of our school year. Each day, I pulled my hoodie tighter around me, a flimsy shield against the arrows of cruelty that seemed to fly directly in my direction. I lost friends, I lost joy, and I sat in silence while my name became synonymous with ridicule. I began dreading the walk through those school doors, feeling the heavy weight of shame, like a cloak that had been stitched together by every cruel word. It was as if every laugh in the hallway was a reminder that some stories have no heroes, only victims. I started seeing Mrs. Perkins less as an ally and more as a source of disappointment. Her suggestion echoed in my mind: had I been weak by telling her? By doing something? I felt caught in a web of self-loathing and guilt, one that twisted itself tighter every time I was labeled as a tattle or, worse, a coward. My trust in adults wore thin, slipping through my fingers like sand as I realized this cacophony of cruelty felt tolerated. Days bled into weeks, each worse than the last, until one fateful afternoon when Jacob decided to take things further. During gym class, in a cruel stroke of fate, he managed to coordinate a moment that would forever mark my life. I was paired with him for a team exercise. The moment he stepped closer, I could smell the sweat mixed with arrogance, a vile combination that churned in my gut. "Are you going to run away like a little brat?" He sneered, pouring scorn into those words, and every ounce of my resolve melted away. Instead of freezing, instead of standing tall, anger surged through me, fueled by weeks of torment and shame. In a fit of rage, I swung my arm, a clumsy, desperate act born from pain, but it landed hard against his shoulder. The room silenced as if time itself had held its breath. I couldn't take my eyes off his shocked face, and for a fleeting moment, I felt powerful. But any sense of triumph was short-lived. Before I knew it, he retaliated with venomous fists, turning that forgotten gymnasium into a cage of chaos. I'd become the villain in my own story, surrounded by chaos, and the teachers pulled us apart, leaving us sitting in opposite corners of the principal's office as the narrative twisted. I was labeled the aggressor, the troublemaker, while Jacob donned his martyr's mask of innocence. Moments later, under the fluorescent lights that seemed to mock me, I finally spoke up, fearing for my future yet again. I recounted everything, how I had tried to stand up, how I had only wanted help, but in the eyes of the adults, I was merely misbehaving. "This isn't my fault," I cried, the desperation in my voice ringing hollow under their indifferent gazes. I became the conversation topic in whispers during lunch, and a target in the anxiety-ridden dreams that plagued me every night. My friends distanced themselves, afraid of catching what they labeled my drama. I lived in isolation, cocooned in a construct of my own guilt, paralyzed by the need for validation while crumbling beneath the weight of blame. The dreams turned darker, the whispers morphed into chants echoing in my head. I began to wonder if maybe I did belong in the shadows, if Jacob had been right all along. A year went by, each day a collection of silent scars grafted into my soul, and just when I began considering leaving school altogether, a weird email appeared in my inbox, one that made my breath hitch and my heart race. It contained a recorded conversation between Jacob and a mutual friend, a confession made in chuckles and arrogance, affirming that he orchestrated the entire thing with malicious intent, to bring me down, to revel in my despair. In a world that had painted me into a corner, I emerged, holding this tiny, clipped audio, a talisman of truth. Part of me wanted to send it off, share it with everyone who had ever judged me, but fear laced my hands. Who would believe me? I could feel the familiar voice in my head saying it was all just my fault for ever speaking to the counselor, that I had become nothing more than someone to be ridiculed. But I couldn't let Jacob's cruel laughter win. The next morning, I stood there, heart pounding, as I played the recording from Mrs. Perkins, tears of rage spilling over. She listened, the colors draining from her face, each slur echoing like a drum roll at a dark circus act. Days later, the principal called an emergency assembly, and for the first time in so long, the power had shifted. I stood in front of the student body, fog settling behind my eyes as I recounted the truth, knowing there may be repercussions but refusing to be the puppet in this horrid tale any longer. The gasps around the gymnasium filled the space like a chasm of realization, and the terrible weight of how I had felt for so long began to lift like a dawn breaking through a long night. Jacob faced the consequences. Suddenly, my once silent monster wore chains, and slowly the whispers turned into empathy. But still, as I left the auditorium that day, I could feel the air around me stifled with the remnants of hatred and, for the first time, a flicker of hope ignited. It wasn't an end, it was just the beginning of understanding that sometimes, telling the truth, no matter how painful, can set you free. Yet, no matter how much I felt liberated from the chains he had forged, I knew that I would carry the scars of that battle forever. So, I ask you, Ida, for telling the guidance counselor my classmate called me a slur? Because somewhere deep down, I am still that kid whose heart raced at the thought of being silenced, and to this day, that fear lingers, waiting for its moment to return. I never imagined I'd be embroiled in a battle of morality with my sister, especially not after a long day that started with the usual chaos of life with my own kids. But my phone rang in the middle of a meeting, and it was like my heart stopped when I saw her name. Sarah never calls unless it's an emergency. "You need to come to the school now," she snapped, and it felt like ice water poured into my veins. "What's happening?" I asked, dread crawling under my skin like a swarm of ants. "It's Liam. He's waiting for me, and I forgot to pick him up." In that moment, the world around me blurred. My mind replayed the image of my sweet, innocent nephew, all big brown eyes, and that shy smile, waiting all alone in a cold, unwelcoming cafeteria long after the bell had rung. I felt a surge of rage and disbelief. How could she leave him there? "You put your phone on Do Not Disturb? Are you kidding me?" I yelled, my voice rising in disbelief. She dismissed my concern with a wave of her hand, as if this was just a minor inconvenience. "It's just a kid. He'll be fine until I get there," she responded too casually, shrugging her shoulder as if it was no big deal that her first grader was more vulnerable than a single light bulb flickering in a pitch-black room. I was enraged, imagining that little boy, staring at those doors, waiting for the only adult who he thought would pick him up, and instead, feeling the creeping realization that he'd been forgotten. My voice echoed through the phone, louder and sharper than I intended. "You need to stop acting like this is acceptable behavior. What kind of person just leaves their child behind? What are you thinking?" And as soon as I said it, I felt a chill run down my spine as if something sinister was watching from the shadows. I drove to the school, every nerve ending in my body aflame with anxiety, imagining all the worst-case scenarios, the cruelty of older kids, the indifference of teachers, and the emptiness of that cafeteria. When I arrived, I burst through the doors. My sister was already there, but it wasn't her face I was looking for, it was my nephew. My heart raced as I scanned the space, and then I spotted him at a corner table, head resting on crossed arms, a pathetic, lonely figure surrounded by the echoes of laughter from children who had long since reunited with their parents. "Liam!" I called out, my breath hitching as he looked up, his tear-stained cheeks sending a dagger through my heart. He sprinted to me, wrapping his little arms around my waist as if I were the last lifeline in a drowning sea, and I couldn't hold back my own tears. "Why didn't Mommy come?" he whispered, his voice thick with confusion. I couldn't answer, as rage bubbled up anew along with maternal instinct. I turned to Sarah, my voice low but fierce. "How could you do this to him?" But the confrontation was interrupted by the school principal, a stern gaze beneath her thick glasses. "I really need to speak with you both," she said, and her tone suggested this was more than just a simple late pickup. We were ushered to her office where she would reveal a deep concern for Liam's well-being, her voice grave. "We've had reports of disturbing incidents in the area lately," she said, and my blood turned to ice. "Children have gone missing after school hours." My heart dropped as the implications sank in, visions of what could have happened to Liam racing through my mind like a runaway train. I looked at Sarah, her face pale as she glanced at Liam, who now stood wide-eyed, oblivious to the danger that could have befallen him. "I didn't know," she finally gasped, the reality of her negligence crashing down with the weight of 1,000 boulders. Everything changed in that moment. I could see her fear reflected in Liam's face, and it was then that I understood. She wasn't just careless, she was lost in a world of her own, one that wouldn't allow her to hear the tiny voice of her son, or the muffled cries for help of countless others trapped in their phones or their own minds. The principal continued, "Children need their parents more than ever, especially during these times." As she explained more about the cases in the area, I felt the air grow thick around us, suffocating. I had imagined a confrontation filled with shouting and blame, but instead, we were faced with the reality that we weren't just failing ourselves but the very ones we sought to protect. My anger morphed into deep sadness, the kind that grips you and doesn't let go, leaving room only for fear. My accusations hung in the air heavy, yet silent, while all I could hear was Liam's soft breaths and the distant voices of children still laughing outside, oblivious to the darkness lurking just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. What haunted me then was the realization that perhaps, long before this incident, Sarah didn't just need me to yell. She needed me there, to guide her and Liam from whatever darkness she had fallen into, and that made me angrier than the reckless act itself. The principal's voice faded into a blur, warnings turning into echoes, while I held Liam close, swaying gently in a world now filled with shadows, not knowing if we'd ever truly be free of the hidden fears that lurk behind our screens, threatening to dissolve the fabric of our most sacred connections. How much longer could it go on like this?